In Tanzania, on the east coast of Africa at the White Sands Hotel, the South African-based Center for Justice and Crime Prevention brought together a diverse group of people to share knowledge and experience on preventing youth violence. Some young African women have led the prevention agenda.
But not to leave you all gloom and depressed and think Zimbabwe is a terrible nation. It's also a nation that has got very vibrant young women like myself. And there are things that, as an organization, as Zimbabwe Young Women's Network for Peace Building, we have said, you know what? We did a research and young women can actually do something in terms of conflict transformation. So quickly, I'll give you some of the things that we thought could help in terms of young women participating in conflict transformation. And the first thing is, as Sally Kempton says here, men define women's intelligence, they define usefulness of women, they tell us what is beautiful, and men even tell us what is womanly. But we found that as young women, we can actually begin to say, no, we've got to start redefining what it is to be a young woman and a young woman participating in different sectors, and especially in democracy. And once we do that, we begin to own conflict, understand it, and be able to participate more. And other issues are also documenting experiences. We noticed that as an organization, if you document an experience, someone can begin to own their experience, whatever form it is, or whatever form of conflict, be it personal, systemic, or whatever, and begin to actually demand for answers as soon as they snap out of their trauma. And also, young women can be mothers. They can be people who actually facilitate the process of socialization. And it's important for young women to advocate for nonviolent strategies for conflict mitigation. Mother, that great stone, half remove.
And of course, there's a moment of song.
Great stone, stone of child abuse. Mother, that great stone, half remove. I come from a region that gave the ideology of Pan-Africanism to the African world. But I also come from a region where when people cannot talk, they sing. And so sometimes when the unspeakable has to be confronted, it is easier done in song. In the little island that I come from, there are Crips and Bloods and guns, and young people are murdering one another. Again, the business of what is masculinity and how is it expressed, and how it is that perhaps we need a revolution in the whole business of socialization. We all need to learn how to use language differently in the response, to refer to prostituted children instead of child prostitution. The language of the market is ever present, and yes, the human body is for the market. The chat room, parents need to know the language of the chat room. And if we say violence, will we get the outrage? How is it that we can strengthen our families, not just in the Caribbean, but wherever child abuse is happening? And again, we have to recognize the need for targeted interventions, whether it be in the workplace or wherever, but to reach parents. We need to have a common understanding about this CSA as a human rights issue with a public health response. And we talked about some of all this morning, the youth-sensitive justice systems, and again, having evidence-based interventions. And while we do share globally, can we forge a Pan-African partnership in which we'll address the scourge of child sexual abuse? And of course, the answer is? Yes. Thank you very much.
The remainder of the day included speakers looking at the role of data and evidence, the need for knowledge-based interventions in crime and violence prevention from the UN, integration of youth violence prevention into national policy from Mexico, and a report on a theater project from Zimbabwe.
How many people would be flattered by an invitation from Patrick or anyone else to come and speak about the topic of failure?
Because we're often using government funding or donor funding, it's often very hard to acknowledge failures and to learn from those failures.
Thomas Jefferson has this great quote that's used a lot in this field where he says, "I have not failed 5,000 times. I have successfully discovered 5,000 ways that do not work, and I do not need to try them again." With the assistance of the U.S. Department of Justice, about 5 years ago, we began a series of projects examining failure. And the idea here was to look at, not to look at corruption or not to look at malfeasance, of which, of course, we know there's plenty of that around, but at well-intended efforts to achieve stated results that for one reason or another ran into problems. And this picture here is a book that's come out on this subject, Trial and Error in Criminal Justice Reform. And basically the idea here is to get people who are respected and confident enough to talk about what hasn't worked in a context where they're seen as successful people, and so that that people will, be interested in listening to what they have to say. Each of the failures that we've looked at is unique in its own way. We've been able to discern that they kind of tend to fall into one of four categories. The first is, failure of concept, a bad idea. And I think most of us can imagine pretty easily that, some ideas just are bad in the first place, and no matter how they're implemented or anything else that happens, you can look back and say that idea just wasn't a great one, The second one is implementation, where the idea was perfectly good, but how it was implemented was kind of seen as the reason that it didn't work out, and we'll talk about that some more. Failure of politics, both uppercase and lowercase politics, is huge in examining these case studies. Whether people had trouble attracting money and other kinds of resources in the first place, or whether that became an issue of sustainment. And finally, failure of self-reflection, where in promoting an initiative in order to get that support, the political support and otherwise, we talk about the good things, and for the support to continue, we keep focusing on the good things without being reflective and self-critical to kind of understand what's really happening here and how well is this really working, and should we be making some changes. If we can create an environment where things that don't work are talked about as openly as possible, we can create an environment where there will be where we can encourage experimentation, where we can try new things that we're not sure that are going to work, but will give us the opportunity to learn what doesn't.
Day 2's afternoon sessions looked at gender violence prevention and youth in post-conflict and fragile states. State-sanctioned and gender-based violence was covered by speakers from Nigeria, Rwanda, Tanzania, and the DRC. The after-tea sessions included report backs on girl empowerment and strategies from various youth programs. Day 3 brought us notes on skillful parenting.
I'd like to engage you in a few moments of imaginative nature. Can you please, my fellow colleagues, imagine if you are taken back to your childhood years? What are some of the things you'd like to change about your years? Will you consider about changing the type of friends you had then? Will you consider changing the type of the neighborhood you grew up in? What about the types of schools, religious institutions? And the most important part, will you think about changing the type of parents and caregivers who raised you up? Just to give you a hint on that, we have something on the slide. If you can't go back and make a new start, you can start now and make a new end. Welcome to my presentation. The organization had a key vision to create a society where children are empowered and parented to reach their full potential. By doing so, we'll be investing in the future of our society and, more importantly, in the future of Africa. Most of us know that parenting is just a mandatory role that doesn't come with any manual. And yet it is a role that most of us have to perform it. It doesn't mean that you are supposed to be a parent to do it. They are caregivers, they are guardians. You can be an uncle, you can be a niece, you can be a cousin. You never know where the position can put you in terms of need for maybe the children you're looking the children you are looking after. Just in a nutshell, skillful parenting involves fathers getting more involved in parenting. We all know the factor which fatherhood plays in our society. If fathers can't be there for children, what do you expect the society to grow up? And as I mentioned earlier about gender being one of the risk factors, being a male is already a risk factor to violence and crime. Male in the house, what do you think about that? The second factor about skillful parenting is having open communication in a family setup. Do you usually still have family meetings as before? Or are we still waiting for those basic meal times to talk to your parents or to your children? Do you usually concentrate much on television instead of talking to each other? What if one day, while you're having your meal, you remove the television from the sitting room? What will happen? Another factor about skillful parenting is having quality time with your children, especially in their early years. Also, it involves encouraging bonding, interaction, and sharing among family members. And more importantly, having the ability to differentiate discipline from punishment. Children who have no responsible figure of authority to guide them through crucial aspect of growing up have likelihood of getting into antisocial behavior and negative peer influence.
The importance of using tools like drama, radio, and social media was highlighted.
With social media, it's an open source forum. No editor sanctions my blog, my tweet, or my post on Facebook. In my country, Zimbabwe, it is very difficult to rely on the traditional forms of media.
The radio teachers, the mentors, and the children interact each other. So what is that day? Sunny day. It is sunny day. That was sunny day. Good children.
The conclusion came from the Tanzanian Inspector General of Police.
Too often, addressing youth violence is seen only as the concern of the police. And yet, if violence is to be prevented in the long term, it takes every sphere of society, from our parents, our schools, our community leaders, and our political leadership to play their part in providing environments which children and young people are raised in healthy, pro-social ways that will prevent them from turning to violence, and where society provides for the fundamental rights and the need for young people as they grow from children into healthy adolescents and adults.
Bringing to an end 3 days of invaluable discussion, shared experience, research, stories, and possible solutions.